First question out of the gate, might as well just dive right into it. Are vegetables bad for us?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think it depends on who you are. I mean, I think a lot of us tolerate vegetables very well, at least most of them. We evolved alongside a lot of these foods, and we've evolved mechanisms to adapt to dealing with them. So a lot of the natural toxins that are in vegetables, which are there to protect the plant, we either don't absorb them, or the ones that we do absorb, we rapidly detoxify and eliminate them if we're healthy. But the problem is, some of these foods are pretty new to us and we don't have a lot of mechanisms for dealing with them. And, for example, the grains and legumes, which are newer. But then even some of the older foods, once we have some gut damage or some metabolic damage or immune system damage or microbiome damage, we may not be able to process those natural toxins properly anymore, and they may be able to actually breach our defenses and make their way in. And some of us are therefore very sensitive to a lot of plant compounds. So I was able to eat pretty much anything I wanted until I was in my early 40s, and then I wasn't. So I think it really depends on who you are.
One thing that I really like that you talk about that's a little bit different than I'm hearing from other people is, what a diet change can do to the mind. And I really like that side of things, because I think there's a lot of people that the weight of the world is just crushing them. They're upset, they're depressed, they're not happy with themselves. They have a lot of anxiety, and obviously there could be a cascade of reasons why they feel that way. And certainly just eating meat is not necessarily going to solve all their problems. But can you talk about that a little bit? How do you see this playing out for, some people that may be suffering from anxiety and depression to change their diet up to maybe they're going from eating junk to a carnivore style diet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's true that just eating meat doesn't solve the problem for most people. Most of the people in the world who have mental health issues already eat some animal foods. The vast majority of people do not eat a vegan diet. And so simply including animal foods in the diet doesn't seem to be enough for most people. But there are some really key dietary changes which can make a huge difference if you have a mental health problem. If you're listening to this podcast and you have a mental health problem and you don't want to take medication, or the medications you're taking aren't working very well, you don't like the side effects, or you can't afford the medication, there are a lot of other things you can do to help yourself feel better. And it's really about, one of the things I like to say is the most powerful way to change your brain chemistry is through food, because that's where the brain chemicals come from in the first place. Mm-hmm. So if you understand which foods are most likely to be working against you, and you remove those foods, and you know which foods your brain needs, and you include those foods, then you can really make a huge difference. A lot of people are able to reduce their need for medication, or in some cases even eliminate their need for medication by making those choices. So people have a lot more control than they realize.
Do you think that some of this stuff was, some of these issues may have been caused from bad food? So if good food is kind of helping us out of the situation, do you think bad food may have played a large role in why so many people have anxiety and depression?
I do think that's the case. We don't have a lot of studies to guide us yet. The field of nutrition, like nutritional psychiatry, for lack of a better phrase, is really in its infancy. The studies are, we need a lot more studies, but there's a lot of science already, not clinical trials where you take people and you change their diet and you see what happens, because we only have a couple of those actually, but lots of good. We know a lot about biochemistry and physiology and anatomy and history and anthropology and plant chemistry, and we know how foods work in the body. We know what the brain needs. So taking all of that science, it seems really clear to me how we should be eating if we want to optimize our mental health.
So you mentioned certain foods are working for us and other foods are working against us. And obviously you've used a lot of this in your practice. So which foods, or what are examples of foods that are working against us?
Great question. So there are the two biggies in my mind are the refined carbohydrates, anything that gives you an unnaturally high spike in insulin blood sugar levels. And those are things like sugar, flour, fruit juice, processed cereal products, those kinds of foods. and refined seed oils, the so-called vegetable oils, which are things like soybean oil and canola oil and sunflower oil and cottonseed oil. These are highly refined, unnatural products, which are they promote inflammation. So in a lot of the mental health disorders we now understand are driven by inflammation, like a microscopic inflammation, not the kind you can see, but the inflammation inside the brain. So refined carbohydrates also drive inflammation. So, and there are lots of different ways that those two ingredients so refined carbohydrates and seed oils, vegetable oils, those two ingredients, those are the signature ingredients of modern diets. And a lot of people think, oh, modern diets are bad because they have too much meat and too much saturated fat. That's ridiculous. We've been eating those things for time immemorial. What's new are the refined carbohydrates and seed oils. Those were not present to any significant extent in our diet a long time ago. That's really where the problem is, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to figure out, for somebody that's listening to this that maybe doesn't have the courage to go see somebody like yourself, and maybe they just don't even have like a real traumatic experience, because that's even more complicated, I guess. But they just don't know where to start. They just typically don't feel great about themselves. What would be a good place to start? Is there a podcast or a book or articles that you've written or things that you've read that would be a decent place for someone to start?
Oh, that's such a good question, because I spent all of my training learning about the biology, the biochemistry, and psychotherapy, and then as my practice matured and I became interested in nutrition, I now spend all my time studying nutrition. And the psychotherapy skills that I have, I developed over a long period of time, partly through training and partly just through experience. It's kind of hard to summarize those things for somebody else. And I think it's really hard to work on a problem by yourself. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And you don't have to work on it with a psychiatrist. Just, it's really important to share. I think if I had to say one thing to people out there, if you can't afford a psychiatrist or a therapist, or you don't want to go see somebody, or for whatever reason, having whatever problem you're dealing with, trying to deal with that by yourself is not a good idea. Share it with somebody, anybody to start with. Just start talking about it, because it's the problems we don't talk about that really eat away at us and can be so toxic. And so just finding a group in your area, or finding even an online support community to start practicing, sharing whatever it is you're afraid to talk about. You will find very quickly, whether it's in your community or online, you will very quickly find other people who are struggling with very similar things, because all of us have problems. And it's just, I think that suffering alone is the shame of that. It's really can make everything 10 times worse. As a psychiatrist, I've worked with quite a few people who have taken fasting to an unhealthy extreme. And I've worked with a lot of people who are intentionally ignoring hunger cues, underfeeding themselves, trying to go longer, for the sake of, the longer you fast, the better, some sort of virtuous goal, or imagining that they are, this autophagy where you're sort of eating, your system is cannibalizing all of its unhealthy cells. Like, people are imagining that the longer they do it, the healthier they are. And I think that it can be abused and misused just like any plan can be. And I have worked with quite a few people who are starving themselves because they have perfectionistic tendencies or competitive tendencies, OCD tendencies, kind of obsessive compulsive. It's really important to make sure you're not overdoing that, because the brain needs certain nutrients very frequently. And a lot of the vitamins are water soluble. And if you're not eating regularly, you won't be getting everything you need. So be careful.
I was just going to say, you just described the two guys that you're looking at right now.
That's very true.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, throwing us under the bus here.